Right. Hi, comrades, and welcome to this evening's session, which is on the Liverpool in the 80s. Obviously, as part of our series, which has been running for the last number of weeks, and we're now getting to the business end, if you like, the comparison between the 80s and the Corbyn era, which of course do have significant differences, as we will see. And Kevin will go through what happened in Liverpool and the political developments thereof. How long do you want to speak, Kevin?
Well, about 3 hours, Matthew would do me, but I'll keep it to around about half an hour to 35, 40 minutes.
Okay, so we get the benefit of Kevin for about 35 and 40 minutes, which will be good. And of course, we'll then get Roger next week, who will talk about the subsequent witch hunt and obviously the other comparator to what's happening now. So, do you want to make a start then, Kevin? Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, comrades, just some apologies. If comrades thought that they were going to listen to Mike Hogan this evening, I'm afraid Mike's brother is seriously ill, and he gave me due notice last week that he wouldn't be able to do this session. So I've stepped in, but Mike was an active member of the Labour Party, was a militant supporter, and he was involved in many of the activities and would have given a sort of insider's perspective. So it's a little bit of a shame that he can't be here, but he has done some interviews, and there are some things online, as there are various archives and so on, so you can perhaps follow up some of the things that he's written. Okay. I want to begin with what in many ways is, I suppose, insofar as people outside of Liverpool and indeed on the left, or some people on the left, or some people in the Labour Party, I should say, know about Liverpool, is of course the famous Neil Kinnock speech from the 1985 Labour Party conference. And I've been rehearsing this all day, attempting to do my best South Wales accent, but I've given up. I'm just my own. But there is a part where I'm afraid that a Welsh intonation would really capture how he said it. And I'm sure when you hear this read out, you'll remember the speech. It's used in all the clips. What happened was that Neil Kinnock, in his leader speech in the October 1985 Labour Party conference, made, in the midst of the speech, made a very sharp attack on the left, on the militant tendency, but by implication on wider sections of the left. And it went something like this. He was talking about the what he regarded as impossibilism and as rather immature politics of the left. And he says, I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with a far-fetched series of resolutions, and these are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code, and you go through the years sticking to that misplaced, outdated, irrelevant to the real needs. And you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to strut around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers. I tell you, and you'll listen, you can't play politics with people's jobs and people's homes and people's services. Okay, well, I did my best. Now, the point about the speech was that as he started to say this, there was a number of heckles from the hall, and that's why the reference there, I tell you and you'll listen, is important. But the other important point about the speech is that it sort of establishes the, I suppose, what you might think of as the official history. In the last 50 or 60 years or so, a number of key turning points have often been encapsulated by speeches like this. And indeed, even certain phrases have entered into the political vocabulary: the winter of discontent, the unburied dead, rubbish in the streets, and so on. But also the idea that in Liverpool, taxis went around the city handing out redundancy notices, and that people were actually made redundant, and that the city was in some sort of chaos. Now, what I want to do is to sort of begin with that speech and really sort of talk about it and question how far it's accurate, but perhaps more importantly, to try and get us to think about some of the issues surrounding events in Liverpool in that period. Let's first of all, put a bit of context in here. Next week, Roger Silverman, who was a leading supporter of militant and was indeed expelled in the late 80s, will talk about the militant tendency and about its nature in the Labour Party. So I'm not really going to sort of, move into Roger's area, but I think it's important to locate Liverpool in wider British politics in the 1980s, and really, I suppose, the wider Labour left, and indeed the left outside of the Labour Party at that point. Liverpool was an important exemplar of what was happening across many areas of the British working class, particularly the former industrial cities, although Liverpool had always been more of a commercial city than an industrial city. And it was facing very high levels of unemployment. Factories were closing, and indeed one of the big industries in the city, the docks, was really now becoming very derelict. Levels of investment in the city had been falling for years. The city was depopulating, its population was falling each year. And indeed, in terms of all the various social deprivation indices, about life expectancy, about living standards, about nature of housing, and so on, it was pretty well low down the list. Indeed, when a Tory minister visited Liverpool, Patrick Jenkin, Minister for the Environment, visited Liverpool in 1984, he, and this may well have been for effect, but I suspect that it may well have been a reasonably genuine comment. He said he'd never seen such housing like it. And indeed, housing problems and housing issues were really very serious. But perhaps more importantly, and again, this was really across the whole of British society, there was an onslaught by the Tory government of Margaret Thatcher on the living standards of the working class, and on the public sector, and of course on local government, local democracy. And if you remember the importance of the dates, 1984 to 5, the Great Miners' Strike as well. So this was a period of really quite intense class struggle. And in a number of cities, Liverpool was one of them, that class struggle took a very sharp political form. Now, the reason why I want to bring this sort of context about the city is that Liverpool's decline really has been the story of the post-war world. You might even say from the post-First World War. Liverpool was an imperial city. It was connected to all parts of the world economy. And as that world economy changed, and as Britain's place in that world economy changed, then Liverpool's position changed as well. So this decline had been very, very long term. And indeed, in the cabinet papers that have been released in the last 10 or 20 years, the Tories did seriously consider almost a policy of managed decline, a policy probably similar to that adopted in America with some of the great cities like Detroit, where they would in fact almost revert back to being agricultural or just simply abandoned. And this idea that Liverpool had no real sort of function, and indeed that its role as a great imperial port in any industrial role, that this had now ended. Now, this sort of makes Liverpool very similar to all of those industrial areas, and it makes it very similar to what's going to happen in the mining communities when the Tories attack the NUM and attempt to undermine some of the best organised sections of the British working class. But Liverpool, I think, encapsulates something else as well, and that, of course, is its impact in terms of the Labour Party, and indeed the nature of the struggle against it. Because throughout Britain, Labour councils were confronted with, to varying degrees, similar sorts of problems. These problems usually consisted of severe social problems, which then local services were attempting to alleviate, providing decent education, providing decent housing, and of course, all the other social services, social work and support and so on. The Tory government's policy was one of quite consciously cutting spending, a severe form of austerity. And the way that this was going to be done was through cutting local government budgets. On top of this, there were attempts by the Tories to undermine any form of opposition to this policy by legal and other restrictions on councils. So the policy, for example, that had developed in the early 70s, and indeed, as we know from some of these other sessions, where Labour councils might act as sort of socialist bulwarks, as it were, where they might act as points of resistance, such as in Poplar, or indeed in some of the other smaller little Moscows, so-called, in the 30s. Or, of course, famously in the more recent period in Clay Cross in the early 1970s with the Housing Finance Act, attempts were made, and they were successful, to legally undermine the possibilities of doing this. So through controls over the level of rate that could be set, through controls over the budget, and in particular the funding of local budgets, then councillors and the role of councillors was going to be undermined. And so these problems were faced by a whole series of councils in the bigger cities. Of course, as well, this is also the era in which the GLC comes under attack, is abolished, and indeed this idea of the abolition of local authorities and trying to reduce their power and the ability of people to use them as any sort of resistance points was very strong with the Tories. Now, I think Liverpool and the Liverpool left differed from many parts of the country in a number of respects. And one of them, of course, is the existence of the militant tendency as an organized left-wing group. The militant tendency's origins go back into post-war Trotskyism. Again, Roger may want to take some of this up, but there'd always been a presence of the militant group in Liverpool. Indeed, in some ways, it had been one of their sort of base areas. And indeed, people who would later go on to be important in militant had been active in Labour politics in the city from the late 50s. So what you had was the existence of an organised left group with a definite strategy in relation to local government. Now, that militant group, and it's important to distinguish between those who are organised around the militant group, who were members or supporters, who sold the newspaper, who worked under a sort of central political direction and discipline, was, considerable, but it was still very much a small minority. For example, of the 47 or so councillors or 49 actually, who pursued this policy, it's probable, the numbers vary in estimates, but it's probable that no more than about 19 of them were clearly and committed supporters of militant. In other words, to talk about, the council being, quote, a militant council is, I think, a misnomer. However, politically, militant was very influential. And this this influence didn't, I think, only grow from the fact that these comrades were organized politically, but also it grew from the absolute crisis that had developed in the city, and that the type of left position that they were putting forward, did receive something of a response inside the Labour Party itself. Now, Labour in Liverpool had always been pretty well on the right, and again, there's a certain sort of legend which the tourist authorities, often bring up of militant Liverpool, city of radicals. It's always been a militant city and so on. Well, in some ways that's true. There is a history of militant trade unionism, and it would be wrong to say that Labour was never on the left in the city. But Labour, for example, didn't have any MPs in the city until 1923, and indeed the first year in which Labour got a majority of MPs in Liverpool was 1964. And Labour was in many senses, the Labour Party was in many senses very much a type of machine-like party. Again, comrades in Scotland will be very aware of this type of pattern, but other comrades will be aware. You had these, sort of big city bosses. The Braddocks are a good example, Bill Sefton, another one. And the party membership was often kept out of any sort of influence over policy. And indeed, Liverpool as a city was run along fairly orthodox lines. But there was one important area which I think the growth of the left, and this I think is an important point for discussion, could see its influence to be felt. And that, of course, is in the existence of body, the District Labour Party. The District Labour Party was a body made up of delegates from the constituencies and the wards, the trade unions, the Young Socialist branches, and so forth. And it acted in some senses as a central coordinating body. And indeed, what it attempted to do, even before the emergence of a strong militant presence, had been to try and exert influence and control over the councillors. And militants' political line was to argue that the DLP should in fact be the decision-making body and that councillors should take their policy from it. So the DLP, the District Labour Party, acted as a sort of central coordinating point. In the words of Eric Heffer, in his account of his political life, and he'd been in Liverpool for quite a while, although he wasn't actually from Liverpool, he referred to it as the sort of Parliament of the Workers' Movement. And so this is I think, very, very important, because what it meant was that many of the forces that were attempting to shape local government policy came from without. And indeed, they came from ordinary delegates. And this idea of accountability of councillors, in other words, of elected representatives to the democratic bodies of the labour movement, was a very strong element. The other point as well is that there was not only the militant grouping, but also a wider, broad left. And that was, again, a current on the left, which in many ways had a sort of slightly distinctive character, again, in comparison with other left currents of the 1980s. It meant, for example, that in Liverpool, the left was quite strong, but it had a very different character. It was often criticized, and I think, again, this is something to be taken up in discussion. It was often criticized for being workerist, and that indeed the other struggles of those years, particularly struggles around race, around feminism, around Ireland and elsewhere, that these struggles were often put to one side or indeed largely ignored. And there was a criticism of a certain sort of workerism, a certain sort of economism in the politics of this left. But the key point, I think, is that this left was much wider than the militant group, but the militant group was, I think, reasonably influential in shaping the policy direction. The leader in 1983 and in 1984, Labour regained control over the council, and indeed in '83, very much against the sort of swing or against the tide. Labour gained seats, and it placed Labour in a majority in control of the council. People that I've talked to who were on the council, in particular Tony Mulhern, who I did some interviews with, said that they were rather surprised by their success, and not that they, in a sense, had sort of rather landed in an unexpected situation, but they hadn't expected this to occur so soon. Now, their strategy, and this I think is where the debate I think is important in terms of the left, their strategy was, in a sense, to use the local council as a platform for the advocating socialist politics, but in particular of confronting the Conservative government. The argument was, if Labour councils refused to implement cuts, if they, for example, campaigned in a coordinated way, then this would put pressure on the governments to back down. And indeed, initially, this appeared to be successful in the Liverpool case. They managed to secure a number of concessions, and it looked as if they won. Indeed, many of their statements in '84 indicated that they'd in fact secured something of a victory. But it's probably more likely that the Tories were simply buying time, and that they, faced with the miners' strike, faced with the possibilities of other struggles, were simply trying to buy off that particular struggle in Liverpool. The other element I think that's important here is not just that the council would be a place to campaign in the sense of making speeches and demanding that the quote 30 million that had been stolen from Liverpool by cuts be restored, but also it was argued that forms of municipal socialism could develop. So, for example, the Labour Council put a lot of emphasis on council house building. It also put a lot of emphasis on developing a new education plan for the city. So the argument wasn't just simply to continue with the system. It was to actually show a type of constructive politics. In other words, that politics was not just about sort of slogans and demanding the end to the cuts. It was actually pointing in particular directions. Now, the strategy of the broad left, and which in particular the militant group, as I say, plays this leading role, was also to campaign both within the city and further afield. And one of the features of this period are quite large demonstrations and quite large propaganda campaigns. In 1984, in March, I think 1984, there was quite a large demonstration. Numbers vary, but it certainly was well over, I think, 40, maybe 50, even 60,000. Quite a large area of central Liverpool was covered in people. And this demonstration was organized on Budget Day, and indeed it was linked to protest strikes. And it was designed to show a united city under the leadership of the council confronting the Conservative government. And so alongside alongside the normal type of press campaigns, alongside the organization of the council, there was really, very intensive political campaigning. And as I've said, this was in the midst of the miners' strike, and indeed, as comrades are aware, this is a very intense period of class struggle, and you can obviously see that the relationship between what happens in Liverpool and what happens in the coalfields is going to be very important. And indeed, linking those struggles, there was a degree of criticism, considerable criticism, that the council in Liverpool had not done enough to do that, had not done enough to link up. And indeed, as well, criticism from the left that Militant had, accepted some sort of compromise in 1984, and that in a way they'd not pushed on, using the pressure that the miners' strike had built up. Now, that sort of gives you a view of, I suppose, their strategy. The debate very much within, both within the local Labour Party and more widely, was really what sort of direction this was going to go in. The argument of the broad left was that they were not pursuing confrontation for confrontation's sake, that they were trying, in a sense, to secure a just settlement and trying to show that the needs of the city, the needs of working class people in the city, required a certain level of expenditure, and that the government, which had been reducing that expenditure over a period of years, should pay it back. And so this was meant, in a sense, as a demonstration of the impact of cuts on the city. The next phase, in some ways, is the more problematic one, and indeed is the one that leads to the Neil Kinnock speech. The Tories were faced with similar sorts of protest campaigns from a whole series of Labour councils. And those were the Labour councils of the larger cities, Sheffield, Manchester, and also some inner London boroughs as well. These councils were led by such well-known Bolsheviks as David Blunkett and Margaret Hodge, Graham Stringer over in Manchester. And they had talked about a coordinated campaign to confront the Conservative government around the idea of a no-rates budget. Sorry, I will mention Norwich then. Sorry, I'd left you out there, Janet. But the idea was that if a critical mass of councils refused to set budgets and in that way confront rate capping, these were legal restrictions on the levels of increase of local government rates, then this again would force a crisis in which the government would be forced to back down. Now, this strategy was not one. This strategy was not a particularly popular one in the Liverpool Labour Party, but they indeed went along with it. And much of the debate was then how they should proceed further. And this is where I think the Liverpool situation then starts to become embroiled with the politics of the rest of the left. The other councils retreated from that position. In the end, there are only two councils left holding up the no rates position. One was Lambeth in London. Ted Knight was the leader there. And the other one was Liverpool. And so again, I think we have this sort of argument, which we can see from our own day about the nature of the Labour left and about its coherence, not only in the face of the Tories, but also its coherence within the party itself. Neil Kinnock, pardon me, sorry. Neil Kinnock, as Labour leader, was arguing fairly consistently for staying within the law, of using councils in the famous phrase as a dented shield. So the argument was, and again, it is an important strategic question about socialist strategy, I think. The argument was essentially that if we, as socialists and as Labour Party members, did not use the law, if we did not use the mechanisms in some sense to obviate the cuts, then our own populations, our own supporters would be, very badly affected. But of course, the key question for Neil Kinnick was to keep within the law. And indeed, although thered been much sort of militant talk and the idea that if all the councils stuck together, they could defeat the government, this really very quickly fell off. So the dented shield in the end proved to be very much less of a shield and just full of a great deal of dents. And indeed, councils then found themselves introducing rent and rate increases, and of course, in that sense, really carrying out the policy of the Tories. So the idea that they were, in a sense, defending their constituents, they were defending the working class, very quickly was proved to be illusory. So the strategy of the broad left in Liverpool was then to really, push through this, policy, continue with it, and continue to make the point that many of the promises that the Tories had made the previous year had not been fulfilled. That for example, the promises on the housing programme, promises to give certain spendings for social services and other activities had not come through, and so the problems of the deficit were growing, growing greater by the day. What also complicated this wasn't just the attitude of the other left councils who've sort of fallen away from the fight. It was also divisions within the Labour group, and indeed increasingly a right-wing group, a very small handful, half a dozen, sometimes as many as 8 or 9, but still enough to cause difficulties. So again, you can see this idea of a sort of militant council is sometimes, greatly overstated. So you have that dissension. You also have, I think, the role of Neil Kinnock's leadership, and that speech, which I began the talk this evening, was one where he was now starting to move fairly clearly against the left. And in doing so, he began to work with what was increasingly seen as the soft left. So that somebody like David Blunkett, who'd been one of the more left council leaders in South Yorkshire, quite famously attempted to broker a compromise, trying to draw Liverpool in towards this legal policy. That again sort of shows the trajectory of this left in the Labour Party. So Liverpool increasingly found itself isolated, under attack from within the party leadership, but also now increasingly under attack from the council, from the Tory government, I should say. And of course, this now began to be quite a serious situation. Legally, as comrades who were councillors or have been councillors, and I see there's a surprising number of them, will know that councillors have certain legal obligations, and that if they don't fulfil those obligations, for example, if they don't set rates or they allow deficits to occur, then they can be liable to not only a disqualification and removal from office, but they then can be surcharged. And so you increasingly found here a growing tension between the pressure building up from the Conservatives and the financial crisis. Over 1985, you find a number of expedients were attempted. I won't go into these in any great detail. They often involved various deals with banks, offsetting future rent income, and so forth. Some of them were of doubtful legality, it was ruled at the time. And what they were essentially attempting to do was to buy time. But I suppose in a sense, the difficulty was now that Liverpool was on its own and it was now facing these attacks. The other political difficulty was that inside the movement itself, and this again is perhaps where strategy and tactics and so forth can be questioned, was that the earlier fairly solid support that had existed in the trade unions, and indeed in a more widespread sense in the city, was starting to fragment somewhat. I've talked about the divisions in the Labour Party, but there are also divisions inside the unions. And again, looking at the accounts and the interviews of people in the years that followed, it was very clear that not only the union bureaucracy, but others were either not convinced of the strategy or indeed were actively seeking to undermine it. You could also argue that one of the difficulties with the strategy of confrontation, or indeed of pushing up to the limits, required a great deal of support, which had existed in 84. But when it began to look as if the government would refuse to back down, some sections of both the council's workforce and in other parts of the city became hesitant. And indeed, when in September 1985, attempts to develop a citywide strike in support of the council were rejected by a joint union committee, it began to look as if the situation was now proving almost untenable. It was then that, again, as part of these expedients, and this is perhaps the controversial area, and again, it would have been good for Mike to talk about the debates on this, were the possible expedients of using redundancy notices and indeed other measures to try and stave off the deficit. Now, I think in retrospect, many of the comrades in Liverpool, not just militant comrades, but the broader left in general, realized the difficulties and indeed the fact that the tactics of this were not widely understood. The other thing, of course, that we have in this period, and in a sense, I've not mentioned it because I would assume that the comrades know, but I will emphasize it, that while this battle's going on between the Tories and the council, between Neil Kinnick and the other soft lefts in Liverpool, there is, of course, a massive media campaign. The local newspaper, the Liverpool Echo, is producing very vicious propaganda against the council. And indeed, in the city itself, more generally, there are all sorts of movements and groups trying to undermine the council struggle. Now, in the elections that occur in 85 and indeed even in 86, Labour still maintains its position. In the 85 election, there is a slight fall in the number of votes, but Labour is still able to form the ruling group there. But this campaign is very vicious, and increasingly it's focusing not just on the irresponsibility of confronting the government, but it's arguing that the city is now being dragged into chaos, and that indeed this crisis is reaching sort of climactic proportions. If you want to get an idea of it, look at any of the daily newspapers, particularly The Sun, but even the so-called liberal press as well, such as The Guardian, and of course the Liverpool Echo. even I would also suggest the news media, the television and so on, all pushing in that way. Even Paul McCartney was mobilized to attack what he saw as irresponsibility in the way that the city was being governed. So the presumed threat of redundancies, which was a tactical move, was one that I think very few workers understood. And indeed, it in some ways represents the sort of nadir of that movement. The beginnings of the onslaught are the disqualification of 12 of the councillors and a series of by-elections, and indeed a fresh series of elections which enabled the Labour right to regain control. At the same time as this is going on, the District Labour Party is disbanded, and indeed we see the beginnings of the witch hunt, which Roger will talk about next week, which are now really being broadened out. So I want to perhaps leave or to begin the discussion on a number of general points. First of all, about the whole strategy of municipal socialism, or indeed the idea of using councils as a platform in this way. Comrades who are, I think in Scotland, are confronting particular cuts. There are no Labour councils, or not many of them that I'm aware of, but we will have the similar sort of arguments being used here about the use of councils. And how do we agitate around these demands? Do we suggest that it's possible to use local authorities in this way? And do we, if we do see alternative municipal strategies and confrontation, are these likely to end in the same way, the period of isolation and indeed certain defeat? The campaign that the broad left and the militant comrades in Liverpool carried out was clearly one that has a lot we can learn from. It was a campaign that was attempting to mobilize workers. It was a campaign that took the issues out into the streets, and it did build considerable support. It was also a campaign that the Labour leadership undermined, and indeed many elements on the left, although ostensibly being willing to support the fight back, very quickly retreated from, leaving Liverpool relatively isolated in that way. So I think that the lessons for us, or certainly the topics we need to consider, is what we can learn about campaigning, what we can learn about strategy. I don't think that the militant comrades believed that they could build socialism in one municipal area. And I think that they did see this as something of a beacon, as something that could help to rouse the movement in that way. The questions we have to ask ourselves, I suppose, is this a correct tactic? Is this the way that it can be done? And above all, the distinctions within the left. Much of what happened in Liverpool, both within the city itself and nationally, was the role of other sections of the left undermining that struggle. In particular, unions inside the city. There were members of the Communist Party and other organizations who, in a sense, worked to undermine the struggle, although many individual members of left groups clearly supported it. But I suppose for us, we can learn from this period of struggle, not only in a sense how we might conduct struggles in this way, but also their limitations. As I said, Comrade Mike Hogan, who I would be very familiar with, were both in the same constituency, always made the point to me about the way that the campaign was undermined, but also some of the tactical problems. And those tactical problems were not just simply, I think, tactical missteps, but they do flow from some of the nature of some of the left wingers, and in particular the ongoing witch hunt that really began in '86, and then of course was to accelerate in the late '80s. But I see that there are comrades here from the chat box who would have some personal experience of that, and it's probably as well for them to come in. So that's my introduction, and I hope comrades will take part in the discussion and really look at this period very closely, and particularly look at the mythologies that the Labour right put up about it, and particularly the mythologies they put up about the unpopularity of left politics. If we learn anything else from this period, the electoral successes of that council and indeed some of their practical successes show what is possible, with all the limitations that I've outlined. Anyway, thanks, comrades. Okay, thank you, Kevin. We'll get lots of people to contribute to this. I mean, I think this is some really key questions that have come out of this, and obviously a key point in history in which a lot of people here, I think, we're present. So I think we should I'm hoping we'll have quite a lively discussion, because I think everybody will have a view. If not, they'll have questions. So can you, Mike Kennard, I think, wants to make a point. Because I'm not host on this. So.
Yeah, I promoted Mike to panelist, so he should be with us any minute. There he is. He's coming in.
Right. Okay, Mike. Do you want to make your point? You need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Yeah, it's really a sort of a question for discussion, I think. Obviously, the right of the Labour Party were terrified of what was going on, and Kevin's pointed up the role of the district Labour Party, and this is at a time when the class was in quite serious struggle against a very reactionary Tory government. The question is, to what extent, whether consciously or unconsciously, were the right afraid of a dual power situation developing, that their sort of total commitment to parliamentarianism was being threatened by this municipalism, and to some extent, I mean, the way that Kevin described it, the District Labour Party could have been the embryo for a developing Soviet in the city, and this is sort of carried on since then. Of course, I mean, the disbandment of District Labour Party, particularly Brighton being the prime example. So alternative non-parliamentary centres of discussion and power of policy making. So I mean, how does that fit?
Do you want to answer that, Kevin, while we try and provoke some more people to ask? I'm pretty sure we'll get a rush at the end. Everybody will want to ask something, or say something.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think you're right about the potential that was there. I did live in Liverpool in the late 70s and into the early 80s, so I was sort of aware of some things that were going on. But in this heroic period, I deserted and went to work somewhere else. But certainly, you're certainly right, I think, about the potential for that struggle. I think one of the difficulties, though, and this is where I emphasize the nature of the council, and that was that the council as a whole certainly wouldn't have wanted to see Soviet power. I couldn't really see John Hamilton being a great advocate of it, and I think that may well have held back the conscious sort of arguments for that sort of position. But certainly the levels of class struggle. There's also some argument about both the strategy of sections of the left in the city, and also, I suppose, whether the levels of consciousness were moving in a much clearly revolutionary position. I think that's more likely to be the case in '84 with the miners' strike. And again, you'll be aware of some elements in the miners' strike where there were real confrontations between pickets, and indeed in some cases, sort of clashes that did raise these questions. So I think it's certainly implicit there, but I'm not sure that it was raised in the city itself. Certainly when you look back over some of the material, some of the leaflets that are issued, you do get a sense of moving towards that. You also have to remember that in '81, we had the riots in Liverpool 8, which again had raised confrontations with the state. And of course, the Joint Union Committee, which I think is absolutely vital in understanding what's going on, those sorts of demands were starting to be raised there. But you could also argue that the difficulty or the problem of focusing on the council was in some ways that it sort of keeps the struggle within that municipal boundary. And I also think one of the other difficulties, although I understand why it was done, was on the no rates question of sort of in a way linking up with a whole series of councils who were always fairly half-hearted. I mean, you'll remember Blunkett's attempt at a party conference that he was chairing of trying to get a compromise motion and so on. So I think that that probably, if we're going to be critical, I think that the criticism of that other left should have occurred very earlier. But and that then I think starts to raise the point you're saying. But certainly the potential for a movement of that sort is there. I don't think it's fanciful to talk about it. But again, it's trying to spread that movement, and that's the key thing, taking a movement of that sort out from just one city into the rest of the country.
Right. Okay. Well, there must be some other people who want to speak on this. I mean, in terms of this, I mean, my recollection of the whole thing was really around, obviously, the importance of the miners' strike as being the defining, really the defining act, if you like, of the period, and not obviously goes out beyond the 80s. Becomes is actually the point at which the Tories, having been defeated in the era of Heath, were determined to smash the NUM. That was what it was about, and actually as part of the whole business of attacking the trade unions. I mean, the thing that really struck me later, having come into activity very young at that point, was that the fact the left actually never bothered to develop any kind of counter strategy to the Ridley plan, which was published, and the Tories actually said in advance what they were going to do, and then or it was published what they were going to do, and then they went and did it, and nobody had actually sort of worked out what the counter was, or even discussed what the counter could be. That was extraordinary, I think, and I think that as you say, I mean, in terms of the people looking at things, instead of looking at the left looking at things in a strategic way, or attempting to tie everything together, things tended to get lumped into little bits. One dispute at a time, or whatever. And the key thing really was to open a second front, in support of the miners. And there were numerous, actually quite numerous points at which that could have been done. You know, but they were all stifled, and Liverpool was one of those. And I think it was a tremendous failure to not see that, you know, to see that as a strategic point. That really that was the key to the whole piece. And that was the focus of the attack of the Tories, and they were going to. I mean, they did. I mean, they did buy off. They were quite happy to buy off the workers. I mean, they were giving out pay increases to workers in order to keep, you know, just to keep people happy. While they smashed up, smashed up the organisations they wanted to smash up, particularly the NUM. You know, and actually, of course, the working class, the living standards for workers, people who were still in work, carried on going up in the 80s. That was the point. The problem, the thing was, of course, obviously the Tories successfully managed to make a very large number of people unemployed and to destroy, huge areas of industry. And it's extraordinary time. We still, certainly in most of the cities I've lived in, here in Glasgow, there's still the marks of what they did in the early 80s. Or if you, I suspect you can still go to Liverpool and see the marks of the effects of what they did. You know, the vacant sites and where once there were these enormous factories and other things, and the shopping centres which occupy in some cases the corners of enormous industrial sites. So yeah, I think that becomes the real point is the lack of strategic focus on the part of the militant, but also the rest of the left. And I'm still looking for anybody else who wants to contribute. Come on, comrades, you've got to say something. You'll all be sorry when you haven't.
I was going to just come back in, Matthew, because there has been, unfortunately, I can't keep up with the chat, and there's an interesting chat, and all the comrades who say that they were on this council and that council and so on, and should come in and talk about the issue. But I was thinking of your point about the serious attack on the left, that on the working class that's being carried out by the Tories. And I suppose that, like lots of things, that narrative has been sort of smoothed over, as it were. It's been rather, it sort of focuses on Thatcher, and it focuses on a few key points. But it is quite a conscious strategy, I think, of deindustrialization and of reducing the power of the working class, and in particular of giving support to financial capital. So what happens, with the attack on the miners isn't just, as Boris Johnson was trying to pretend, a bit of a forerunner of COP26. It's because the miners are a very well-organized section of the working class. And if you're going to smash the working class movement, then you go for people like that. That's where you go to it. So I think that the failure of the left was really a reluctance, to really appreciate that and really appreciate the seriousness of that situation. Mike's point about dual power and about what could have been achieved, and indeed the sorts of issues that were being raised in the miners' strike, I think were really quite important. If you look at the strategy of the Labour leadership, and remember that Neil Kinnock had come from a soft left background, but had very clearly then, sort of revealed his real position, then you can see that was always trying to restrain the struggle. I mean, comrades will remember his role during the miners' strike. And indeed, if you look at his whole policy, and I'm sure Roger will look at that next week, that what he's attempting to do is to not only restrain the left and prove the respectability of Labour, but he's also trying to purge the left elements. He's more successful in bringing them into the fold, and that's where the David Blunketts and others will then become important. And of course, this, I think, is where the parallels with our own day come in, and that is that the soft left, who give apparent support to militant struggles, then start to row back. And that was, I think, very important in isolating the struggle of Liverpool. And of course, within the city itself, you then get critiques and criticisms coming in from that soft left. So, the focus on Kinnick and indeed the focus on Thatcher also doesn't point up the role of many people who were allegedly on the left, who then went later on to quite reasonable careers. Unlike, the disqualified Labour councillors, many of whom were in, real privation, but, the movement did rally round and, did display a great deal of solidarity. But there's a real contrast between fighters like that and, the official leadership of our movement. When Neil Kinnock talks about pickling into a dogma and so on, well, that's all well and good, but all that his type of politics do was to just make endless concessions to the Tories. Anyway, comrades, I do hope comrades can come in and make comments. I've been keeping the seat warm for you.
And now we have a whole pile of people want to speak. That's great. Okay, so George, do you want to make your point? Can you put your unmute and put your camera on?
Yes, I'm the proud possessor of a book called Liverpool, the City That Dared to Fight by Tony Mulhern and Peter Taff. I don't know whether you can remember that. And reading through it, first of all, I wonder whether, I know that Felicity Dowling was one of the councillors in Liverpool, and I know that she's still around. Whether she's here at the meeting or not, I don't know. But my thinking is that you've got to have the broad support of the public. An example I could give perhaps is Sheffield City Council, where it in fact actually nationalised the buses, and it received widespread support. They had a very long struggle fighting to retain this situation. And of course, my own personal experience was with the GLC as an area for struggle. But not only that, the GLC crossed all boundaries of spectrum of the local population, culturally, industrially, working with the unions and so on. And I'll give you an instance where I was involved in contracting for the GLC. I was involved in a very large contract with them, and we were issued with a contract compliance policy, which required membership of the trade unions, and we had to work to safety standards and so on. But I really do think that there are a number of examples all over, as you've rightly said, big cities where there have been struggles at different levels, and where the city was taken over temporarily. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, comrades. Can we have Mark Metcalfe? Mark, can you unmute yourself and put your camera on?
Can do. Hello. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay. A few personal recollections might be of importance. In the lead up to the miners' strike of 84-5, some mining communities did, of course, attempt to draw up some contingency plans for the strike. Myself, I was one of a handful of people who in the December of 83 got together to set up what was called safe easing area mines. And the strategy was that we would set up support kitchens and build local support if there was a strike. I was a convener, but also I was the night shift shop steward, or one of them, Tudor Chris factory at the time in Peterlee. And I was a semi-skilled machine operator at the time. And I remember asking at those meetings, was it hope to get other people to engage in industrial action? And that was looked on with amazement, to be fair. And I didn't really possess the politics myself to try and argue that through. I was quite young at that period of time. We went ahead, actually, and on the 25th of February, ironically, held a demonstration. It was quite a big demonstration. We attracted about 2,000 people. That's 25th of February, just before the strike started. So people knew the strike was done. Actually, the key guest speaker was Neil Kinnick, as it happened. So he came along and spoke. I mean, during this period of time, although I wasn't a member, particularly because I had strong disagreements with the militant over Ireland, I did sell their newspaper through a lad called Tommy Bennett, who became a local councillor at the things. And I can recall there was never anything about widening the struggle in any ways. And certainly my own union, which actually shows how long ago it is, was then called the GMWU. It's now the GMB. Would never have, under any circumstances, argued for further action. But it did come up at work. We did have incidences even where managements were abusive to many of the women that worked on the lines, and even a very brief stoppage at one point caused by the antagonism between management and antagonising miners' wives. Nothing that you could say you could have built on at that immediacy as it goes. But I don't think there's any doubt that the biggest opportunity for development action came through the dockers. And I don't know if people can remember, and I'm quoting here from something I've picked up, but it is something I think which is sure. It was provoked when the British Steel Corporation unloaded materials on the Humber. And this work was normally done by dockers under the National Dock Labour Scheme, which people would be possibly aware provided employment and income security. And it was like part of the social democratic legacy of the 1940s, and which had been picked away at both by Wilson's government and increasingly was getting picked away by the Thatcher government. And it was the sort of last one to go in terms of the industries. Well, anyway, there was a strike which took place over this, and there was a split between the various sections in the Transport and General Workers Union. And Nicholas Ridley, obviously talking about the Ridley Plan, he actually got up in Parliament. It was in the June and July, and said that they had no plans to abolish the scheme. And what happened was the strike was called off. Ironically, actually, I was actually present in one of the places where there was a massive scrap as a result of this situation. Anyway, it was abandoned, the strike. The dockers went back to work. There was, again, as you'd expect, some attempts by some more militant dockers, particularly out of Tilbury, which is, of course, ultimately why they were sacked in the lead up to the abolition. So anyway, to cut a long story short, of course, the abolition of the National Dock Labour Scheme took place in 1989, and it probably marks the end with respect to others, and I'm not knocking those who've gone on to engage in struggles since, but it probably marks the end of the organised working class in terms of struggle. I would probably contend in terms of something that had the possibilities of dealing quite a severe blow to the government and obviously to the ruling class. And we're now in a situation that's often been community-based struggles rather than industrial struggles, which of occasions had the ability and the opportunities to deal some difficulties for the ruling class. Anyway, thanks for your time. I hope that gives comrades who weren't around during that period just a brief glimpse of what it was like. I think the other thing which was instrumental, which shouldn't be forgotten, is that the struggles which took place, they came after a period of time prior to that where there had been some attempts, hadn't there, particularly via Tony Benn, to give the working class some control over the methods and means of industrial production and industrial means and operations. Because as we know, in the 1970s, many major industries could not have operated without, and in many areas, docks was one of them, but there were also loads of factories where workers themselves, in essence, ran those factories, and the management, whilst they had control, the actual techniques and the production and the rest of them rested on the significant skills that people had accumulated from their dads and their granddads and the rest of them. So there was that possibility of the workers taking control of those industries. Anyway, thanks very much.
Hey, thanks, comrade. Can we have John Gibson?
Yeah, hi. Okay, just a couple of questions, really. I wondered if Kevin didn't really say a great deal about the GLC during that time, which for me, as somebody who lived in London, partly during that time, was quite a radical local authority and improved the lives of Londoners in many ways. And I think of policies such as the Fares Fair, which benefited Londoners, getting about and all of that much more affordable for ordinary working people, and the whole Ken Livingstone administration as leader of the GLC, I thought was a really positive thing, making a positive impact on society. We witnessed in 1979 the election of the Thatcher government, and that introduced a whole new neoliberal policy, much more radical than the governments that had preceded it. And so from then on, the Thatcher government attacked many bastions of the working class and the left, and removed power from local councils and all the rest of it. But they also attacked individual groups, travellers and what have you, and asserted the violence of the state during that time. Obviously, as we witnessed it in the miners' dispute. I'm originally from Yorkshire, and police would riot through people's homes and estates and the mining estates in and around the coalfields up in South Yorkshire. And at the same time, we had them attacking the communities in the inner city, and London burned in 1981. We had the riots in Brixton and Toxteth up in Liverpool, and all of these things meant that from then on, and they continued for the next 40 years, really. We've continued to, from that up until 1979, we'd seen advances in conditions, and thereafter it's been a downhill slide, I'm afraid. Thanks. Just wanted you to comment a little bit more on the GLC and review. Thanks.
Thanks, comrade. Can we ask Helen? Can you unmute and put your camera on?
Yeah, yeah, hi. I put my hand up when nobody was actually speaking, so this might seem quite minor. I was on holiday last year in a nice area in Spain, and somebody commented about the masks and the situation that we were going through at the time, or we still are. And the lads were from Liverpool. And I said something that started off the conversation about the whole Liverpool situation from the 80s. And, you know, Tony Mulhern's name came up. And we went into a really big sort of discussion about everything that had occurred. And I thought, this is great. It's the first time I managed to talk politics for ages, let alone actually on holiday. And my question really, in a way, is that, you know, given the way that Starmer has attacked Liverpool, or attacked us all, but we've particularly seen attacks on Liverpool, it just seemed to me that the older generation in Liverpool still remembers what occurred in the you know, in the 80s and, you know, to the mid 80s with the Liverpool councillors. And I was just wondering if there's still a bigger movement that's occurring there, whereas it's not perhaps occurring elsewhere. I must admit, I live in quite a nice area now and not in the Shepherd's Bush area that I was, you know, where I was brought up. So, you know, politics is not discussed in quite the same way here. But anyway, that's my question, and I just thought that I would mention it.
Thanks, Comrade. That's one of the great things about being in Glasgow, of course, is that the place is marinated in politics. You can't avoid it. Kevin, do you want to respond to some of that?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and thanks for Comrade's comments there. Just in response to George, yes, Felicity is still active. She spoke at a meeting that I was at about a month or so ago, and I was involved with her when she was a member of the NUT, which would be the late 1970s. So she's still around. I think George's point about the nature of support is important, and I think that that, you know, the council in Liverpool did have that sort of support, particularly I think in the initial period. The elections in 83 and into 84 showed that, and in a way, when you link that with the miners' strike as well, it does show the sort of fear that the Tories had. I think, though, the policies in other councils, you know, and I don't decry, you know, the stuff on the buses and so on and so forth, fair's fair and so on, but I think was of a different character. And I think the movement was of a different character. And I think there are a number of local factors in Liverpool. Some of them are historical, and some of them are quite important organisationally about the nature of the Labour Party in the city, which give it a sort of different, you know, character in that way. And that really links into John Gibson's points about the GLC. I deliberately didn't touch on the GLC, John, because, or didn't talk about it in great depth, because I was asked to talk, or Mike was originally asked to talk about Liverpool. And I was sort of, you know, a bit of a late sub coming in on that. I think that there were no differences. And I think that that is important because, and it's where I talked about the focus of the council on, you know, particularly on housing. And I think, again, the GLC was dealing both with a different city. Also, it had different powers and different structures. And indeed, you know, Thatcher made a very, you know, strong attack on it in that way. But John's points about local democracy, the district auditors and the threats to use commissioners are very important, because the issue in cities like Liverpool was one of democracy as well. And the argument that the central government could, for example, decide whether a councillor should stay in office for pursuing manifesto commitments, or that there should be commissioners introduced, as we've currently got in the city and, you know, where a lot of local democratic functions are superseded, that I think was raised, and, you know, I think is quite important in that way. The subtext, Mark Metcalf talked about it a great deal, is of course the miners' strike in 84 to 85, and also the extent of working class power. This is when I do feel like an old git talking about, you know, the good old days. But I just think of any number of disputes or any number of issues nowadays, which in the 70s and 80s in workplaces would have led to, you know, immediate strikes and the reinstatement of the worker, or, you know, that the employers couldn't get away with a lot. And what the miners' strike was designed to do was to smash that. And when you link that into what was happening at Wapping and any number of other disputes in that way, then you can see what that is. So what we have to remember when we're talking about this period, particularly to anybody who's sort of, I suppose, below the age of 40 or 50, is to remind people that this movement that we're talking about was very powerful, was very widespread. You know, the District Labour Party in Liverpool, through party members and affiliated membership, had something in the region of about 100,000 to 150,000 affiliated members. When the District Labour Party met, it had at least about 250 to 300 delegates. And so it wasn't just a sort of small group of people. You know, these were quite widespread organizations, and they rested on that sort of power of the working class, which Mark refers to in that way. I also think that the sort of consciousness of a lot of workers and activists was clearly of a different character. You know, they were, you know, they'd come out of a different political tradition. Again, it's very easy to be sort of nostalgic, and I don't want to, you know, do the good old days routine and so on. I had enough of that when I was younger, with people telling me what it was like in the 20s and 30s. But I do think it's important when we think of the potential of struggles, you know, to see this. You know, if, for example, someone suggests today that council fighting the cuts, you know, could be the basis of a Soviet, then, you know, people just look at you. But that, I think, as Mike said right at the beginning, that was certainly implicit in a lot of things that were happening. And just like the miners' strike as well, you know, that sort of struggle for power was clearly implicit in it. Helen, yeah, Tony Mulhern died. Oh God, I can't remember. I think it was before COVID. He did a little sort of autobiography, which I made some sort of contribution in getting together, and it's well worth reading. Partly because it gives you an idea of the sort of city that produces people like Tony Mulhern. There's a whole load of comrades like that, and, you know, again, a whole number of struggles in other cities that do that. I think it's important to not just keep the sort of mythologies of movements alive. I think it's also important to discuss, you know, what they were really like, but also, you know, strengths and weaknesses, strategic failures, and so on. So not just to have a sort of, you know, good old days routine. There is an awareness. There is an awareness of that, you know, I think in Liverpool and in many other cities, you know, and I mean, Matthew will know about Glasgow, although again, the mythology of Red Clydeside, just like other aspects, you know, often needs to be interrogated. I think it does exist still in this city, in Liverpool, but I don't think we should overstate it. Remember that all the tendencies and currents that have happened elsewhere, you know, the deindustrialization, the attack on working class living standards, the rights to organize, you know, they're all there. And, you know, all the general sort of demoralization. I mean, you know, we're like other areas, you know, where once we could have meetings of 200-300, you know, those have now dwindled down. And so I wouldn't want to pretend that somehow we were immune. But the point is that if we know our history and if these things can inspire us, then it is a basis to work from. Anyway, I'll shut up and let other comrades come in now.
Can we have Janet then first up then? If you want to unmute and put your camera on.
Yeah, I'm not putting the camera on because my Wi-Fi is very odd and my microphone and camera. So, just a few kind of unrelated points in a way, but I think Kevin was talking earlier a bit about, you know, the soft left versus the militant left, and I don't mean militant with a big M. And I think that's kind of right, but it's a bit, I don't want to say simplistic because that sounds, it wasn't, certainly in Norwich, which had had an ILP council and a Labour council forever. So it was a very strong, and actually still is in some ways, very strong Labour city. But I think it had, within that, we had a very large Labour group. And within that, there were some of the older councillors who were not left, really. They were kind of in the old right tradition, but they came from the trade unions. And they certainly weren't soft left. They were a different species, really. And I think they were passionate about council housing. They were passionate about, you know, making the city, about poverty. They were passionate about all those things. And if the soft left were there in a way, they came from the university. And then there were the left as well, some of the left. So I think it was a kind of a bit more complicated than that. And obviously every place is different, which does lead me a bit onto the GLC, because I think I'm probably, I think the GLC, when I think about that time, there was Hodge, Blunkett and Livingston, who were the kind of municipal leaders. And I don't think I felt really that, I didn't feel the GLC was, it was clearly doing good stuff. It was doing good stuff around equalities, around transport and so on, but it was a very different kind of thing. And Livingston was a very different kind of leader. There was no sense of solidarity with it was a bit later than the main Liverpool thing, but there didn't seem that kind of solidarity really. And I think what Kevin was saying was entirely right about the betrayal really of Blunkett and Hodge was because they're careerists. I mean, that was extremely important, because I think there were other places that had the kind of background, and certainly within the trade unions as well, that they could have built on or worked with what was going on in Liverpool. And then, of course, we had the poll tax, which you haven't talked about, which was really led from outside the Labour Party and outside councils. I mean, by that stage, and it was only, 3 years later, the fight was not within councils, even in a struggle that was basically about councils. So something had happened, I think, in those years. But just to say a bit about militant in Norwich, we had we had no militant councillors, but we had a lot of militants. As I said, I was married to one who became a militant organiser. So I guess this is a bit personal, really. It seems to me they were very different in a way from the Liverpool ones. They were younger, they came from the Young Socialists, they weren't very experienced, they were very passionate. They were also, we had a very large general committee, 100 people came every time, 120, 130. Left wing, it was basically left wing, but they failed to really win people over. And I think some of that was, those of us who were either involved or know about militant, they didn't persuade people because of the way that they went about it, which was alienating. So, that's not just about ideology, that's about an approach, I think, that probably was different in Liverpool because it was more embedded in the culture of that city, and because they were older. I guess they were older, I think they were older. So it didn't take off in Norwich, but we could have certainly done stuff. And we wouldn't have been militant, but I mean, we certainly fought around things like the poll tax, the right to buy, where we had commissioners in, but it was very fragmented from that stage, from about the mid-80s onwards. There were fights going on, but they were not coordinated, they weren't strategic. That's it.
Okay, thanks, comrade. No, that's very interesting there. Steve Freeman.
Hi, Matthew. Hi, Kevin. Hi. And also to the comrade who's wearing a Leeds United shirt previously. I didn't catch his name, but that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. Anyway, that's another story. So I wanted to just, comrades have sort of said this in a way, and it's drawn it together. And I'm glad Janet just brought in those points, that we need to think of this as the kind of destruction of the limited democracy that we have, and the character of, well, I would call it the Tory state from the 19th century, where the power of the crown grew massively through 2 world wars. So you have this huge bureaucracy centered in Whitehall. You know, we've seen Yes Minister, you know, which was the comedy show about the way in which Whitehall worked and the relationship between ministers of the Crown and civil servants and how that's working. But the other side of this system was that we had extensive local democracy. You know, England is not France. You know, we say France, you know, on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, every single child in France was learning the same lesson, you know. So we had a different model of democracy, where council housing extensive was locally controlled. Local education, local police services, the rates system that we had, and all these things allowed, of course, the working class to have some influence in local affairs. And this is what was coming into crisis with Thatcher's neoliberal policy, because neoliberal, by creating this crisis, was creating these local struggles. Thatcher wanted to get rid of council housing, not just because she wanted to sell it off, but also because she saw that was the way in which the Labour Party got votes. Because people could vote for the Labour Party knowing that the council rents and things would be locally controlled. So in Westminster, they used council house sales to sort of gerrymander the elections, famously. They got caught out for doing that. So I think what's happening here is this is a crisis of local democracy going on, Liverpool being a central example of that, and the centralisation of more power into the hands of Westminster, into the hands of the state, you know, as a result. And of course, in the miners' strike, you saw that centralisation in the way in which the police virtually occupied the mining villages in a highly centralised political operation from the centre, taking control of whole villages and things like that. So local democracy was being really under attack. So I'm glad that we mentioned the poll. I mean, obviously it's out. I don't know where the beginning and end of this story, but the poll tax was also, and Janet mentioned this, and that's really important to see, the next step on was the poll tax, which is again a part of the same thing, and the privatisation of council housing and removal of lots of the local services. And so in a way, this is the beginning of the story of the fight against the poll tax, which again, the militant tendency played quite a big role in that. But of course, it was also a big link to what happens in Scotland, by the way, and and if you like, a democratic movement in Scotland that drives the Blair government towards granting a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh Parliament. So there's a comeback to this through the anti-poll tax movement, which was massive and it eventually led to Thatcher's defeat. So I think this is the sort of collapse of or the destruction of democracy, which local democracy hasn't ever recovered from this period, by the way, and I think that can't do so without dealing with a massive concentration of power in the hands of the crown, which we've been seeing ever since, you know. So yeah, that's probably what I want to say.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, as we've got nobody else, and we're beyond 7:30. If you, Kevin, wants to wrap up, I do think there's a couple of points I just want to make very briefly there. I mean, I think first of all, the point that Comrade made about the nature of the right wing, I think is important, because I mean, what you did have, and I remember it very well in the 80s, of course, was that the right wing did have a social base in the working class. I mean, there were working class right wing Labourites, you know, And there are none now. I mean, they just don't exist. You know, that whole base has been destroyed, obviously, because I mean, now if you want to go into left politics as a working class person, then you're going to be on the left. Because there's nothing else, and these politics clearly can't deliver, and that's finished. I mean, I remember my GC in Coventry. I mean, it was huge. It was all delegates. It was all out of mostly out of engineering factories, and it was split absolutely down the middle. And you'd have a big hall. They'd hire the biggest halls they could in the area to fit everybody in, and it was split evenly between left and right. And literally one sitting down on the left and sitting on the right, there'd be a division down the middle, and you wait for the fight to start in the middle. It never quite did. It did in the district Labour Party Coventry. There was actually a fight at one point, but it got to these point. But it was all, the whole room was solidly working class, and that would never occur now. It just wouldn't happen, because that right-wing base is gone. As one of the old councillors in Coventry, I believe, said in 1976, when the cuts started under Dennis Healy, when this process is finished, he said, we'll all either be Trotskyists or Tories. So, which is a bit pressing, but I'll leave Kevin to wrap up. Thanks, Gomez.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone who's asked to comment and so on. Just to explain that we were asked just to talk about Liverpool. So the other things, and particularly the poll tax and GLC, didn't really come in, and I deliberately put those to one side. But what the comrades have said about them is very important. I think Janet did make some very important points, and I like Matthew, I'm very well aware of the nature of the Labour right. I had large numbers of them in my family, and particularly I'm very interested in the sort of welfare state model, the social democratic post-war settlement, which meant that getting houses and facilities for our people was very important. And that old right, there was a material basis for that, as Matthew says. The state not only could provide the resources, but so could capitalism. And that sort of social democratic politics of the old right, which links them back into the trade union bureaucracy and is very much part of the Labourist tradition, is, I think, very important. The reason why I talked about the soft left was that the leaders of many of the bigger authorities were from that sort of current. And they had made a name for themselves in verbally fighting the Tory cuts, and indeed in the early 80s there was an argument that we couldn't win a general election, but we could use the local authority as a basis for fighting. And so I wanted to draw a distinction and indeed their role. I mean, I'm aware that the bulk of councillors, throughout the country were often of the old right. There were a number of them in Liverpool. It would be a great mistake to think of every Labour councillor. Sorry, someone's made a rude remark about my uncle in there. Mike, come on, don't speak ill of the dead. But seriously, the main point is that that you have to look at the role of that soft left group who had gone along with the struggles in Liverpool. And as we know today, I was trying to draw very clear parallels between, the Corbynites, the people who back Corbyn, have now either gone into a neutral position or gone completely over to the right in that way. The other thing I think that's important is that local government is a good place for careerism. And Mike Kennard's remarks about a relative of mine were exactly that many people became councillors because not only could there be a bit of a career in local government, but also it was a stepping stone to Parliament. Although I will say one thing that's rather different, and when I got back involved in politics after a bit of time away, I was shocked to find that there were councillors in this city who, through various allowances and chairs of committees, and one thing and another, could have an income of anything up to £30,000 or £40,000 a year. You know, the days have long gone when all you got was your bus fare if you had to go on an official visit to look at the local sewage works. So it's now quite an important, you know, career in and of itself in that way. And I think that sort of careerism, you know, the cadre of Labour MPs is often drawn from local government, and it was often very much a stepping stone in that way. That was very much a case when the sort of counter-revolution came in the late 1980s in Liverpool. People like Peter Kilfoyle and Malcolm Kennedy, who had been opponents of the left, then found themselves new positions, and you know, very quickly. And that really links into Steve's point about local democracy, and that I think is important. We need, I think, to talk about a socialist strategy in terms of municipalism and what Labour councils can and can't do. But we also need to argue around the nature of local democracy and the centralisation of power. And Steve was quite right. Historically, local authorities had a very important place in the politics of Britain. You know, popular and popularism in the early 20s was rather like the old London County Council and indeed Birmingham Council, City Council under the Chamberlains with its gas and water socialism. These were places in which it was possible under the old constitutional dispensation to carry out various forms of municipal improvement. And to a certain extent, I think that what some aspects of the militant program, you know, did draw on that. Now, whether that's a viable form of struggle and whether, for example, that's what we should be doing, I think is an important discussion. You know, if you get Labour councillors, what should they do? Should they simply, in a sense, use this as a revolutionary or a socialist platform? Or should they attempt to, for example, carry out practical improvements? And what should those be? And, you know, I think in many ways the Liverpool struggle and the other struggles since then have really thrown that up in that way. But I think the key point about the 1980s, which I'll just round up on, is that this is a period when the British ruling class launches severe attacks on the working class movement and then on the gains of the welfare state. And that is that's clearly the context of what's going on in Liverpool. Now, I think we're going to enter into another period in which there are attacks of that character. And so our strategy for how we resist those attacks, but more important, our alternative to both social democracy and to capitalism, you know, what place does these strategies have in that? How do we build parties and movements that are going to counter that? So that's really why I'm interested in the patterns and the developments in Liverpool. And I hope that, you know, this is the beginning of a discussion. But next week's contribution from Roger Silverman will be interesting as someone who's involved in these events at a much more senior level than many of the comrades I now know in Liverpool. Anyway, I look forward to hearing that next week.
Okay, thank you, comrades. I'm hoping that tonight's been useful, and certainly thanks for the contributions. And I enjoyed it, and I hope you did as well. And we'll see everybody next week for Roger Silverman and the witch hunt against the militant. Thank you. Good night.